everyone. My name is Blake and I will be your moderator tonight. Tonight we're joined by Michael Snider for a look on how he uses the 3M Chairside Zirconia Blocks in practice. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go over some housekeeping. If you have a question, please type it in the box labeled "Have a Question." This webinar is sponsored by 3M. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Hope everyone had a great evening. We are here getting ready for Thanksgiving at this point, so I hope people are going to have a great vacation, a couple of days off. And I'm excited to talk to you about 3M's Chairside Zirconia. It's really a very unique material that has made a big difference in my practice. I have been a CEREC user for, almost 14, 15 years at this point. And as the materials continue to come out and continue to improve, I'm always impressed by, one, the selection of materials that's available with CEREC, but when there's really a game changer like 3M Chairside Zirconia, I think it's worth discussing and talking about how it incorporates into my practice, and then seeing if maybe that incorporates to your practice as well. A couple other housekeeping things. I will be going through this presentation as it is recorded and will be presented again later. At the end of the presentation, we will be checking Q&A and chat. Blake, the moderator, will have kind of a list of questions for me. I'll make sure to answer all those for you at the end, so I'll stick around a little bit. And then my email and Instagram, things like that, will be available at the end of the presentation as well, so that if you ever need to reach out, have any questions or concerns, I'm always there for that. So, let's jump into it a little bit. Again, disclosure, I always like to have this anytime I do a presentation. I am, presenting for Henry Schein and 3M for this webinar. I am in private practice. I am a KOL for 3M, Dentsply Sirona, Ivoclar, a couple other companies. So I do receive honorariums from them when I speak about their products that I use in my practice. But I only speak about products that I do actually use. Again, I'm happy to speak about 3M Chairside Zirconia and the multiple uses I find for it in my practice. Talk a little bit about my practice. This is my office on the left side of your screen. You see my team on the right. Myself and then Dr. Lindsay Fuqua is my associate. We've actually added another associate and a couple other team members since this photo was taken back in June. But I'm in a relatively small town, Greenwood, South Carolina, 75, 80,000 people, about an hour from any interstate, and, relatively rural, but we focus on providing a lot of digital dentistry. We do, implant surgeries and guided surgeries in our practice, a lot of endodontics with cone beam and CBCT, clear liners, and a whole litany to be a comprehensive care for our practice. And by doing so and offering same-day dentistry, which is something that 3M Chairside Zirconia allows me to do, I think it allows me to offer a different level of care for my patients, and that's why we've been able to continue to grow and expand. I am visiting faculty with CDocs. You may have heard of them if you're involved with CEREC at all. We have facilities in Scottsdale and in Charlotte, so I help teach for them. I mentioned being associated with Dentsply Sirona and helping to train other doctors as they get into cone beam technology or to CEREC technology. I'm also a clinical leader for Imagine Dental Partners. We are a group out of Scottsdale. I'm the clinical director for South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Texas within that company. So let's talk about, zirconia and why. I think for me, zirconia is an interesting material. I've always been more of a glass ceramics guy. Started with CEREC. There was no chairside zirconia. The milling time and then the firing time or sintering time of zirconia was so long that it didn't make sense for me to have as a chairside option. So I spent most of my time in some of the higher strength glass ceramics, EMAX, and things like this. But everyone picks zirconia for, I think, about 3 reasons. And I think one of the main reasons that individuals will select zirconia first is because of strength. When we talk about strength zirconia, it starts being a question about how strong is strong enough. As dentists, we always like to look at bars like this, and it tends to be that we like to pick, the farthest bar on the left, whatever the tallest bar is. But I don't think that's always the necessary option for us. We look at CEREC zirconia here, approaching almost 1,400 megapascals. This is going to be similar to maybe the Brooks Zier zirconia, the very opaque zirconia that you've seen in the past. And then as we make these zirconias a little more translucent, a little more aesthetic, we do start losing some of that strength. So you can see with 3M Chairside, we've taken a step down. We're a little below 1,200 megapascals. And when we go to Katana, we're somewhere in that 800 range. And with Emax, we probably are more in that kind of 450 to 500 range. But, how strong is strong enough? And I think once we start getting close to 1,000 megapascals, I don't know that I'm getting much difference in the mouth from a 3M Chairside Zirconia in terms of, fracture resistance or something like that compared to the CEREC Zirconia. But what I am getting is a lot more aesthetics than I would get with that really opaque Bruxier type of Zirconia. Another thing we like with Zirconia is the fit. When I teach classes and talk to doctors, I always hear about, Zirconia fits so well, the margins are so great. And there's a couple of reasons why that happens. If you haven't used zirconia in your office or you haven't seen zirconia milled, what you're seeing in this picture to your right is actually zirconia milled and then zirconia sintered. And zirconia is going to shrink roughly 28% or more during the sintering process. And so because it's such a large restoration when it's milled out, and because zirconia pre-sintering is such a soft material, almost chalk-like, it's very easy to get very fine, very detailed margins. It doesn't get chippy along the margins like some of the glass ceramics do when they're milled out. And there is no other way to manufacture zirconia than milling it. So, when I talk to doctors and they tell me they like zirconia, I said, well, you like CAD-CAM. You like CAD-CAM type of restorations because that is the only way that we can design these. And, the fit is very intimate. We can get some really, really nice and clean margins, and you're not stuck always doing a heavy chamfer or shoulder because of the ability of the material to adapt to those kind of margins. And the fit otherwise is unique to milling because if you haven't done a lot of chairside milling in your office, you may not be, used to or hearing the term over milling, but that's what you're looking at here. So what you're looking at on the right side is a zirconia crown that was milled for a custom Atlantis abutment. And what you're looking at on the left side is an Emax crown that's also been milled for a custom Atlantis abutment. And what you see, those kind of ditches that have been formed on the intaglio surface of the Emax comes from the fact that the diamond burrs that are used to mill Emax restorations have a specific diameter. And so if you have a custom abutment or if you have a prep tooth that has some sharp line angles that weren't rounded over, then the only way that that material can be milled so that it will then seat is for it to be over milled. Now the margins don't have any slop. The margins are actually really clean if you look at them and fit very well. But intaglio, there is a little bit of gap there, and that's going to be filled in by resin most of the time, but it will provide probably a little bit different of an intimate fit than what you're going to find with the restoration on the right. The restoration on the right, again, at this point is roughly 28% bigger than its final restoration. It's also being milled with some very fine carbide burrs. We're not using diamonds when we're making zirconia restorations as we are with glass ceramics. The carbide burrs cut very clean, and because they have a smaller diameter, we're able to get a much more intimate fit of the intaglio surface to an abutment or to our prep or to whatever restoration we're performing. And then I think the other thing that comes in zirconia is conservative preparations. I hear this all the time, and I think the biggest thing that we do as dentists is tend to under-reduce. Whether we're doing a zirconia restoration or whether we're doing an Emax or some other glass ceramic, we never quite give ourselves enough room. And I think if you asked a lab tech what are they missing when they look at preparations from doctors all the time, they would tell you that they're not getting enough clinical reduction. And in my office, the very first thing I do if I'm doing a simple crown procedure is that I'm going to be picking up a diamond reduction burr, and I'm going to be using that specific, not for that tooth, but for the restoration and material that I'm trying to use. So if I was going to be using a glass ceramic, I'd start with a 2mm reduction burr. And I want to do the 2mm so that I can get the rise and fall, like you see on the prep here. That allows me to generate some occlusal anatomy in my restorations and have them look much more aesthetic. If I'm going to be doing a zirconia restoration, the minimum reduction that I want is 0.8mm for this material, 3M Chairside Zirconia, but I don't want to be at my minimal reduction because if I am, I start getting very flat restoration. So what I generally will do is work with a 1.5mm reduction burr on the occlusal surface. By having 1.5mm on the occlusal, it allows room for me to design those cusps and those fossa and those marginal ridges so that the crown will actually look like a crown and not just look like a flat piece of porcelain in the patient's mouth. And then, occlusal reduction is not really where we get any pulpal sensitivity from anyway. If we look at this picture, even on the conservative prep, look how far away the pulp is in this illustration from, kind of where the imaginary prep is. But this is similar to a tooth. That axial restriction, when we're coming in from the mesial, from the distal, and prepping circumferentially around the tooth, that's where the irritation, the more we come in axially, the closer we are to those pulp horns that are extending, especially in a molar, to the mesial and the distal. By having that minimal reduction with zirconia, that's where I really like to finish these with kind of like an 014 diamond or something like that, because I know I can get that nice, polished, smooth margin without having to take away a lot of tooth structure. So, again, strength, fit, and conservative preparations, I think those are the focuses in zirconia. And I think that, along with just the success, doctors are able to cement these conventionally. They're not having fracture because, again, of the strength. They're not having gaps at the margin, again, because of the intimate fit. And because we all inherently under-reduce, our conservative preparations tend to work very well with zirconia. I'd be surprised if you are working with a lab and not with a CEREC, that you haven't maybe sent off for a different glass ceramic, and then the lab calls you back and says, hey, would you mind switching to zirconia for this restoration? And usually like, yeah, sure. And the reason I would guarantee you is because of inadequate occlusal reduction. So, if anything, taking away from this kind of webinar, one, kind of knowing why you're picking this material, I think is important. And two, making sure even with a conservative material like zirconia, you're still giving yourself, if you're milling this chairside, or still giving your lab, if you're having still things milled out of office, enough reduction to make, not only adequate but functional restorations for our patient. And the last thing we're looking at is ease of delivery. When we start talking about glass ceramics and the instructions for use or the IFUs with that, those restorations in, there are some, systems and some glass ceramics, when they're at appropriate thickness, that do have indications for conventional cementation, but most do not. Most get all their strength from the bonding. So that's not the case for zirconia. Zirconia in my office, especially 3M Chairside Zirconia, I really get two options. If I want to be super simple, I can pick up something like Relax Luting Plus, which is just your RMGI cement, super simple, fill up the crown, stick it on, wait for the cement to cure and kind of pull it off. And as long as I have that nice mechanically retentive prep, that's going to stay all day, and it's going to be plenty strong without a bonding resin. To be perfectly honest, though, the option on the left side is kind of more where I live. Scotch-Bond Universal Plus Adhesive and the Relax Universal Cement are a very unique kind of partnership of bond and resin, because the bonding agent that you see on the left is a bonding agent that I can use for everything. I can use this for my indirect restorations, crowns, inlays, onlays, veneers, but I can also use it for my direct composites. So there's a lot less bonding agents floating around, which makes it a little easier on my assistants. And then the Relax Resin Cement, I can use it as a self-adhesive cement. So I could skip the bonding step, put that cement in the restoration, seat the crown, cure it. My bond strength has gone up. But if I really want to make my bond strength go higher, if I'm like, man, I don't know, I have quite enough mechanical retention on that prep, I simply can combine these two. So I could apply the Universal Plus adhesive to the preparation, blow it thin. No need to light cure with this system, which is really nice, because if you haven't thinned that bonding agent enough, and some of the ones that require light curing, you can be pooling that bonding agent on the surface and get inadequate seat of your crowns. But the fact that this bonding agent reacts with the Relax Universal Resin Cement doesn't require any curing. I can simply scrub it in, blow it thin, add the Relax Universal Resin Cement to my restoration, and seat it. And once these two come in contact, then the curing process will start. After that, I can use my light to tack, cure, and clean up. So, again, Relax Luting Cement, I keep that in my office. We use it. We use it for, things like, old PFMs that just need to be put back on. If the patient's got one that's 20 years old and it's intact, or same with a gold crown that's just, debonded or become uncemented. But I live more in this resin world, and I really like the Scotch-Bond Universals one bottle system, again, for indirect and direct composites. And you're going to see how nice and small that tip is on the Relax Universal Resin Cement. That's unique in resin cements too, because if you're like me, you notice that these tips get longer and longer, and we have so much wasted product. But with this tiny little tip on the end of there, we don't have hardly any wasted cement at all when we're doing these restorations. So let's get a little bit more into the chemistry of zirconia. And, I don't want to bore you with dental materials. I know no one really loved that course or multiple courses in dental school, but when we start talking about zirconia, it's really important to talk about the different types. We can talk about 3Y, 4Y, and 5Y, and you may hear these terms a little bit, but that has to do with how much yttria is in that zirconia material. If we look at pure zirconium oxide, they're going to call it here the monoclinic oxide. This is just pure zirconia, very, very strong, but not really usable in dental clinics whatsoever. Once we start incorporating some yttria, and here you're going to see the tetragonal kind, 3% yttria, this is going to be the high-strength Bruxier type of zirconia. Okay, so it's going to be what you had when it first came out, even when Glybel released it years ago. Super hard, really, really opacious though. Nothing that I would consider in a premolar area, canine anterior for sure would not be getting this sort of material. But we use this material a lot. Second molars, we tell patients it's basically white gold, and that's what it looked like in the mouth. It always was just so opaque and so bright, and it really wasn't fitting for me. And I was having a hard time switching from glass ceramics to that material because I didn't find it aesthetic enough, even in the posterior, to be placing on our patients. But then more recently, some of these more highly translucent aesthetic zirconias have started to come out. I'm sure people here are familiar with something like Katana. And that is more in this kind of 5% type of yttria. So high translucency for sure. But as we start moving toward that high translucency aesthetic zirconia, we start losing that strength that we all kind of love of zirconia. So we start moving away from that minimal prep of 0.8 to 1 millimeter because we're having to build up that thickness again to accommodate for the aesthetics or the translucency that we're trying to get. And that to me is where 3M's Chairside Zirconia has really become this nice blend of beauty and the strength that we want from zirconia. So if we look at this chart, and we kind of see where things are, on the far left, again, we're back to that kind of 1400, 1300 megapascal strength of ceric zirconia, Bruxier zirconia, that really opaque zirconia. But again, not very aesthetic. We can go to the other side. We can start approaching Katana, which is 5%. And that's a really aesthetic material, I think on par with some of the low translucency or even medium translucency glass ceramics like Emax. But I'm not really getting the strength that I want, And depending on what you read in terms of Katana's materials, sometimes this is going to be dependent on thickness recommended for bonding, right? So, you can get away with cementing it for sure. I'm not worried about that. But it's not going to have that fracture toughness that you want, like you see with a ceric zirconia at the same thickness. But 3M Chairside Zirconia being 4%, this 4Y type of zirconia, fits the bill to me in a little different. I'm above that 1,000 megapascal line, but I'm also about 25% translucency. I'm able to place this in molars and premolars, and depending on the patient's surrounding dentition, sometimes even closer to a canine or something area, depending on if I have PFMs and everything else surrounding it. So that's why this material has been able to kind of come into my armamentarium and find a place because, one, I'm able to do it chairside and do it in a very efficient manner, which is what we're going to talk about next. But two, it's not only fitting, my expectations of aesthetics, but it's starting to fit my patient's expectations of aesthetics, which is more important. And so I like being in that balance between so strong but not very pretty, or very pretty and not quite as strong as I want. And 3M Chairside Zirconia seems to be that one that's just kind of just right for me. So let's talk about how we make zirconia in our office. We have a couple of steps. First, we have to mill or manufacture the restoration. After we do that, we have to sinter it or fire it in the oven. And then we're going to have a couple of ways of finishing it, whether it's polishing, staining, or glazing. And then at last, we're going to have to deliver or cement the restoration. What I'm going to walk you through tonight are two clinical cases. After we go through the process, one clinical case will be kind of the standard run-of-the-mill single unit in my office. And then also we're going to run through an implant restoration and kind of why I like this material in those scenarios as well. So let's talk about the milling process. And, I again, live in a ceric world. I've been using ceric since the days of RedCam. So RedCam, BlueCam, OmniCam, now PrimeScan. And also using the Prime Mill, which is the image that you're seeing here on the right. So I want to talk about the different abilities of the Prime Mill to mill zirconia. What you're seeing on the image of the left is a post-mill zirconia crown for a lower right first molar. The fast mill with the Prime Mill allows me to mill this restoration in about 4 minutes, 45 seconds, something like that. Super, super quick. Now, what you are going to see on this restoration on the lingual is you're going to see a couple of striations. Now, these striations are simple to polish away. These are just marks from the burrs that's going around milling out the restoration. And pre-polishing for sintering is something that, is a requirement for me in my practice. It just makes the restoration pop a little bit. So a simple wheel will take these scratches off, and it'll be very easy for the assistants to do this in your office. But for me, to be able to manufacture a restoration in less than 5 minutes is just unheard of. Now, I can go to fine mill. Fine mill is going to be a little bit smoother. It's going to use some smaller burrs, especially on the occlusal surfaces, trying to get into some grooves. But what you're going to see here is that milling process is now at 16 minutes. And for me, it's just not worth it in the practice, okay? I'm still seeing some of those striations on the lingual. You can see them there, and you can kind of compare them to here. These are a little deeper, and these are a little softer, but they're still there. And it's still going to take the same process of polishing those away, and it's not going to be really any faster. So for me, I'd much rather have the fast mill done, the restoration out, it firing and polishing, and saving myself the 10, 15 minutes or more that it may be to do it on fine mill. And then our last option is extra fine. So if you look at this extra fine surface, what you're going to see, one, is there's still a little bit of striations on the lingual that are going to have to be polished, but the occlusal anatomy is going to be much more defined. And remember, this crown is roughly 28% larger than it is in the sintering process. So as this shrinks down, those occlusal anatomies, the grooves, everything will become very tight, and the occlusal anatomy will be deeper. Extra fine mode for me, not going to happen in my practice, right? So it's a possibility. You can do it, but my assistants can define this anatomy just as easily, and honestly, I think a little bit better with hand instrumentation, simple wheels, and little burrs and tips that we use in our lab to manufacture these, and they can definitely do it in a lot less than 18 minutes. So, I can generally make this crown in about 5. Within another 5 minutes, they're done with their polishing, define the anatomy, and it's in the oven. And I'd have another 8 or 10 minutes just for the milling process, much less the other polishing that would have to occur. So when we compare these, again, I'm living on the left side of the screen in my practice, okay? It's myself, it's 2 associates. We're using multiple milling machines, multiple scanners. But even with that, I want to generate the restoration and have it ready to go. So the one on the left is still going to require post-mill kind of processing. So is the one on the right. But I can save myself 13 minutes plus of time by go ahead and milling it in the fast mode, having the assistants polish this, define the anatomy, and get it sintering in the furnace, and then be out and ready to deliver for the patient. So, what's the differences here, right? Minimal differences overall. Like we said, we still have to polish them either way. Fine mill, yeah, you could do it if the margins are regular. It's going to be a little bit of a smaller burr. I don't find that necessary. But the extra fine does have one use. In my practice, I'm going to use the extra fine burr when I'm doing bridges. And the reason for that is I really want to define the connectors. Where the politics and the abutments connect, I don't want to have my assistant spending a lot of time defining those to make them look natural. The machine actually does a pretty good job at that when you design it, as long as you're milling in an extra fine mode. The other reason I'm able to use extra fine mode when I'm doing bridges is I'm rarely doing a bridge out of zirconia same day in my practice. Most of the time, these patients are being provisionalized. They may be coming back a day or 2 later, but I'm not going to have them there for that longer mill time, then a longer firing time to come back and seat. These are always kind of two different appointments for me. And because of that, I'm happy to use the extra fine because the patient's not waiting in the chair. So let's talk about margin integrity. Here you're looking at 3M Chairside Zirconia milled on fast mode, and I would argue that I don't really see any chipping at all on that margin. And remember, this is still 28% larger than what the final restoration is going to be. This is going to shrink down a good bit, and this is going to fit really intimately to the custom abutment that it's milled for. Again, no over milling on the intaglio surface like we saw with the other ceramics, and that has to do with this material's ability to be milled by carbides and to be milled at such a larger percentage. So how do we finish this? Well, step one, we got to get rid of that big sprue. Anytime restoration is milled, there's some sort of sprue that's on there. And so here you see just a fine acrylic burr being used to polish away that sprue. My assistants are doing this with gloves on. They're doing this over a small little hood that we have set up in our lab with suction. And these are, zirconia particles. I wouldn't recommend having that and inhaling that kind of thing, but very simple, just taking this off. And once this is polished off, we use these blue wheels from Meisinger on a relatively low speed. And this is what's taking off those surface scratches that you saw, right? And I'm going to do this either way. If I don't polish away those scratches now, they're going to be much more difficult to polish away once it's been sintered. Once zirconia is hard and sintered, adjusting it is not as easy. Pre-polishing it now when it's in this soft kind of green state is what we'll refer to it as. Then it's an easier transition to get rid of that, to get rid of the lumps and bumps that may be left behind from milling, and to define that anatomy a little bit more. Once you're done with the polishing, you really got to clean out the intaglio surface and the entire restoration. So you're seeing my assistant's gloves here. They're white, and you can see them kind of brushing out this dust. That white dust on their gloves is inside those crowns, and if that's not cleaned out well, when it fires, it'll leave this kind of weird chalky appearance on the crowns. Now, you can use air to dust this off with, but I would warn you that you need to make sure, one, that the airline is totally air. There's no moisture. Because if there's any moisture contaminating this restoration, when it goes to fire, it will fail. It'll crack and it'll split. It needs to be totally dry. The other thing I would warn you about using air on this instead of something like a horsehair brush is that when you use air, it's very easy to have this thing blow across the room, and it's very fragile at this point. So if it were to hit the floor, hit a countertop, fly across and hit a wall, something like that, it would be very easy to break or chip or even take off a large chunk of the restoration. So we simply just dust it off with a large brush and get it ready for sintering. Once it's sintering, it sinters on the occlusal side down. And there's two reasons for this. One, we don't want anything of the surface dragging. We also don't want anything impeding that shrinking process that's going to happen. So as you place it here, this is the speed fire oven from Dentsply Sirona, very fast firing time for zirconia, something that used to take hours, 6-7 hours sometimes in some furnaces. We have down now to like 20 minutes. So, in total manufacture time on this restoration, right now you got maybe 5 minutes with it in and out of the mill. You got 2 or 3 minutes with, my assistants polishing, getting the occlusal enamel ready. And I got 22 minutes in the oven. So let's just call it 8 between the mill and the polishing, another 22. I have 30 minutes, and that's total for the restoration. My patients can come in and easily have this entire restoration prepped, designed, milled, and delivered in about 90 minutes. And for me, that's a win every day, especially for my associates. When patients come into hygiene, something broken, they want to get it fixed same day, it's very easy for either associate to pick the patient, bring them to their operatory, prep the tooth, scan it, have it milled. And one, it's great for their production, but two, it's a lot better for the patient. They're already off. They're there for hygiene. They don't have to come back for a second appointment. So to be able to do these things chairside, it has, again, just been a game changer in our practice. Once it comes out, it's very hot. You see it kind of smoking orange here, right? It'll have a warning on the screen, do not touch, because it is hot. 1100 plus degrees when that's dropping down. So we're going to let it cool. And as it cools, we end up with this kind of nice restoration. Now, what I'm going to show you here, and this is a, post-sintering image, but compare the crown on the right to the crown on the left. If we start looking at the facial surface of that crown on the right, and we start looking at the facial surface on the crown on the left, we're going to see those striations still present. Now, are those going to be noticeable to the patient or their tongue? I don't know. But what I do know is that the one on the right took maybe 20 seconds to polish it. So by using that blue Meisinger wheel and getting rid of those lines, I just end up with a nicer restoration. I like the occlusal anatomy a little bit more defined. You can see how you can see the rise and fall a little bit there that you don't see on the left. But the bigger deal to me are those striations on the facial surface. Then we're going to do some post-sintering polishing. Same system, this yellow wheel from Meisinger is the last one for a high shine. And I would recommend not doing this too much. We like to get a nice shine. Zirconia polishes beautifully. So easy to polish, but it's easy to over-polish it. And when you over-polish it, it's almost going to become this like pearl opalescence type color. I don't love that as much. Patients sometimes almost say the crowns feel too slick, right? But a simple light touch with this yellow polishing wheel from Meisinger into the occlusal anatomy around the margins, and you'll be in good shape. So here's my entire armamentarium for finishing a zirconia restoration. Literally 3 burrs, right? If you want to call the 2 on the right burrs. 1 fine acrylic burr to remove the sprue, the blue Meisinger twist wheel in the lab handpiece to remove the scratches, and then the yellow one to polish and get the occlusals really nice and shiny before delivery. You can glaze these. It's possible. It's an extra 9 minutes. I argue that our polished ones look better than glazed. And I would also argue that if you are going to glaze these, you still need to polish them. Okay, zirconia can be a very hard material, and it needs to be polished so it'll be kind to the opposing dentition. If you glaze it, it'll be nice and slick and smooth as long as the glaze is there. Once the glaze wears off, it will not be slick and smooth anymore, and it will be kind of wearing that opposing tooth. Any zirconia would. So that's why I like to polish these first and then glaze them if you are going to do that. But in our office, I don't really find much need for this, but it is an option. Extra 9 minutes. If you like that, that's fine. Let's talk about how to glaze though. If we're going to glaze, we want to be holding the mist far away like you see in the picture on the left. I want a nice light frosty appearance on the restoration. I do not want to see what I see on the right. When you hold this kind of mist very close, you start seeing puddle, you start seeing drips along the restoration. This is going to end up with a lot of lumps and bumps along the margin, and as this glaze fires, it can come out looking very kind of orange, peely, a lot of stippling on the buccal lingual surface from where the glaze is collecting. So if you're going to do it on the far left side, but again, when I'm doing these on posterior restorations, I recommend just polishing. There is an interesting phenomenon that I see with glaze, though. These are the same 2 crowns that you saw earlier, and you can see how even the one on the left, when polished, those striations are still there. These are very hard to get rid of if you haven't polished them in that kind of pre-sintering state. But anytime I glaze a restoration, I hope this is coming across on your screen like it is on mine, I notice about a half shade to a shade difference in the restoration. And it's not just with 3M Chairside Zirconia, it's with almost all zirconias. When I polish them, I find them to be truer to the shade that I selected. And when I glaze them, I find them to be a little higher in value. And I don't really like that. So if you are going to glaze, I would recommend considering stepping about a shade down in the restoration when you're milling these chairside. So let's talk about a general single unit, kind of what's coming into my practice and what we see on a standard day. And this is just a standard bike wing taken at hygiene. What you're seeing on that number 3 is some decay with a large existing amalgam restoration. And then we talked to the patient about options. Could you refill this? Could you do an onlay? Would you do a crown? Patient has presented these options and the pros and cons of each. And in this scenario, patient elected to go with full coverage crown. And here's maybe a little bit different of a story. Now you start talking about, well, why would we do a crown? I start looking at the alloy, and I know I have to get rid of all that. I start looking at some of the little bit of occlusal cracks, especially that distal buccal cusp. I think that thing's almost going to go. And then I start looking at the crack running down the mesial marginal ridge and can really have a conversation about, all right, now, 1, I feel justified in doing the crown, but 2, I know that I can do it very conservatively by using a material like zirconia. So that's what we're going to do in this scenario. Patient's prepped and then the zirconia crown is delivered. You're looking at 4 different restoration materials. On tooth number 5 that you see there, that's an old PFM. Tooth number 4, you're looking at a Emax LT. Tooth number 3, you're obviously looking at the 3M Chairside Zirconia, and then tooth number 2, an old composite. But what I would tell you is I think the vitality or kind of the lifelike nature of the 3M Chairside Zirconia, especially that increased translucency, to me, rivals or is on par with the Emax LT there on number 4, and really the MT ceramics as well. And that's why, again, I'm happy to use this in the premolar and molar areas any time of the day. I do really like a couple of things about the cement system we talked about. So when using the Scotch-Bond Universal and the Relax Universal Cement, in the past when I've used some of the 3M cements, especially Ultimate, Relax Ultimate, it sat very quickly. So as the minute the light would hit it, it could be hard to clean up. And the other thing that I didn't really like about it was to me lacking in radio opacity. And I like now how with the new Relax Universal, they have increased that radio opacity. You can see it there on the x-ray very well. And you can see how we got it cleaned up on the post-op. And we do this anytime we do indirect restorations, whether they're inlays, onlays, crowns, even if it's a quadrant, whatever. We're always taking post-op bite wings to check for cement cleanup. can be very difficult to do that sometimes, especially 6 months down the road when they're back for hygiene. So recommend taking these kind of x-rays. You can see how nice and clean that margin is on the distal, even though we were pretty deep from that recurrent decay. But now we got it cleaned up well, and the patient's got a great functioning restoration. So let's talk about implants. I do a lot of implant restorations in our office. They're all guided when we do them. And so, here what you're looking at is a custom milled, custom healer on number 19. Most of the implants that I do, especially single units, I'm doing with a system called a Zento from Dentsply Sirona that's supplying me with my guide, my drills, the implant. But the most important thing to me that it supplies me with is this custom healing cap. Teeth themselves are not round. And stock healing caps do nothing for me in regards to helping tissue grow or mature to a final restoration standpoint. But by placing this day of surgery, I can start grooming that tissue and having it heal and being mature in the right size and shape for my final abutment. So this is a custom healing cap that's made prior to surgery. That all goes into the guide and everything fits. And when I seat this, I can make sure that now I'm going to have this kind of more rectangular tissue healing rather than something round. And this is the kind of tissue that I get from using these custom healers. I would probably better argue that when you remove your stock healing caps that are round, your tissue doesn't look like that. And it's because it's not custom milled for that restoration. It's also because it's not custom milled for what the final restoration is going to be. So when I seat my abutment, it looks like this. And that custom abutment is the exact same emergence profile that my custom healer was. So I'm not getting that blanching. I'm not getting that uncomfortableness when I try to seat it for the patient. I'm also not taking another impression. I'm having this custom abutment made prior to even placing the implant. The guide is so accurate and the timing of these implants is so accurate that I can actually have this custom healer made and it's going to engage the implant. I can know that my final abutment is going to engage the exact same way, same timing, and have this perfect tissue. And then back to the milling of that crown that we showed earlier in the scenario, I can deliver that 3M zirconia crown and cement it with the Relax Universal Cement. And I know that this is going to be super easy to clean up. I can light cure this and literally wipe it away with an Explorer. I'm not worried about cement sepsis because I'm able to judge from that abutment where I want my cement, my split line to be between my crown and my custom abutment, so I can keep it all right, equigingival. And then with this cement and the radio opacity that we saw in the last x-ray, really easy to take a post-op bite wing here and make sure that I have all of the resin and cement cleaned up. Here you see it kind of just pulling off in a really big chunk, right? Super easy to do. One thing I would recommend, and just another kind of pearl for this lecture, even if it's not about 3M Chairside Zirconia, which I do love the material, but I would recommend trying to find an implant system that you can use a custom healing cap with. If you're using stock healing caps, one problem that you're continually going to have if you're taking conventional impressions is you're removing your healing cap that's round. You're placing probably a closed tray impression post. Some of you may be using open tray, but either way, you're taking that closed tray or open tray impression, you're sending that to your lab. Your lab's going to pour a soft tissue model, and they really only have one of two options. They're not getting tissue like this that's shaped like the crown. They're getting tissue that's just a round hole from where the healing cap was. And that means that they either have to, one, under contour your abutment, and if they do that, now we're going to start seeing a lot of food packing in proximally. Patients are going to have problems with the tissue dropping over time. It's just not going to be an ideal scenario for a restoration they paid quite a bit of money for. Or the other option is they can build that abutment or screw retained crown to full contour, but when they do and you try to deliver it, you're getting a lot of tissue blanching. If you don't release those circular fibers that have healed around that round healing cap to release some of that pressure, seating this abutment is going to be uncomfortable for the patient. It's going to require some anesthesia probably, and then you're going to get a lot of tissue blanching. When you get that tissue blanching and tissue necrosis, now we're back to square one and getting recession around our implant. So if you are going to give them an impression with a round stock healing cap, I would recommend that you ask the lab to build it to full contour. I would also recommend that you be comfortable enough to pick up an anesthetic syringe, drop a little bit of anesthesia in both papilla, and then simply incise them with a 15 blade. You don't need to flap them. You don't need to reflect them, nothing like that. Just a simple incision kind of between that distal papilla and the mesopapilla as well, up to the adjacent teeth so that those gingival circular fibers can give, they can open, and then that abutment will seat fully without having so much tissue necrosis. But your best case scenario would be to provide your lab with a custom healer that gives you mature tissue, nice and keratinized all the way around on the buccal, seating an abutment that fits that kind of custom healed area, and then a restoration that does that as well. So in this scenario, you can see, again, we're, kind of pick a color here, right? The patient has a gold crown on 18. We did an A2 here. They have an A3. I think in this scenario, it's more about being functional. I have a lot of patients that don't worry so much about that. But this material is something that I know the margins are going to be perfect on that custom abutment. I'm not going to have any overmilling of the intaglio surface whatsoever. And I know that everything's going to fit very well. So I told you at the beginning I would leave you with my email and also kind of my Instagram handle where we post cases and things like that. We're right at kind of the 45 minute mark. I try to leave at least 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A, and we can answer these things live. You can also always email me or send me a message on Instagram. I'm always posting, like I said, and responding to things there. But I'm going to exit out of the presentation now so that we can see the chat and then hopefully answer any questions you guys have.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
No problem.
As mentioned, we will now open it up for any Q&A. If you have a question, please type it in the box labeled "Have a question" on the right side of your screen. We have some comments, just that some people have been using their 3M zirconia for bridges and find it as aesthetic as katana. And yeah, so definitely if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in. If not, we'll definitely get those answered for you guys eventually. So we'll just wait a little bit to see if we have any questions.
Absolutely. And again, I'm happy you guys are spending some time with us here on a Tuesday evening. Hopefully everyone's had a good week. Hope that it continues to go well, especially through the holidays if you are celebrating, and a good end to 2022 and a great beginning to 2023.
Great. Well, it looks like we covered everything tonight. And as mentioned, if there are any questions, we will definitely get those answered for everyone. Thank you all for joining in on this wonderful presentation. We did record tonight's webinar and we'll email out the recording sometime in the next week. We would appreciate your feedback via our survey that will pop up on your screen shortly. And again, thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Good night.